All right, remote versus in-person. I'm Tim Becker. I am the software platform, the platform engineering lead at Becker Robotics. All right, yeah, which one's better? This is the question that I'm asking, and so I may as well answer it right away. There it is. Thank you, everybody. Now, this is not Ignite, and this is actually too short for Ignite too, so this could have been a poster, but I do need to keep talking, so I'm going to keep talking. So here's some fun numbers for some context. Before the pandemic, only about 3% of the U.S. workforce worked outside the office in any given week. At the peak of the pandemic, that number almost reached 50%, and now we're hovering around 20 to 25%. And it means that in any given week, 20 to 25% of the U.S. workforce is working outside the office. And this isn't numbers for knowledge workers or in the tech community. So I would guess that in the tech community, these numbers are even higher. So we're 4 years after the pandemic forced us to be remote, and how we work has dramatically changed. Early on, the benefits of remote were quickly became clear, and most voices claimed that it should have been the norm all along. At the time, arguments for in-person work were fairly weak and mostly stemmed from people being unwilling or unable to adapt. And at the time, also, the drawbacks of remote work were mostly chalked up to growing pains or pandemic-related issues. Since then, several compelling arguments and several not so compelling arguments for remote work, for in-person work, have emerged. In general, employee engagement, certain creative tasks, and collaboration are much better in person. Unfortunately, from my perspective, a lot of people dismiss these claims out of hand, even when they're based in objective evidence or expert experience. So which one is better? Again, it depends. And hybrid is not the default solution for this. Oftentimes, it can be the worst parts of remote and in-person, and it completely misses some of the key benefits of remote work. So really the solution is that they're both great. Most companies are now distributed, which means certain aspects of remote work can be universal. So a lot of the lessons we've learned from the pandemic can be applied for the betterment of all kinds of work. And overall, instead of binary thinking of one versus the other, we should take the best from both worlds and figure out what works best for us as individuals and for your specific team and your specific company. There is no one size fits all. Any way of working can be done right, and the key lies in being intentional. You can also do any way of work really wrong. Some sizes don't fit anybody. It can be easier to do remote work wrong if you just try to emulate what you're doing in person, but virtually. And in person, it's much easier to become complacent with communication and process, which can lead to distractions and wasted time. If you're not intentional about the way you work, you're going to fail. Hi, I'm Tim Becker, and I'm not an expert. I don't really have an agenda. I'm not a remote work influencer, or I'm not trying to sell a certain way of life. I'm also not in upper management trying to justify my return to office claims. I am a remote worker. I've been remote since just before the pandemic, which meant I got to choose to go remote, and then learned how to do it along with everybody else. It was a great time to go remote. And I work for a company that is mostly in person. Most of my coworkers work in person out of Boston. I also have a lot of coworkers in Pittsburgh. There's mostly working in person, and my company heavily values in-person work, and I agree with them. I think in general, in most cases, here's my first hot take, I think that in-person work is generally better. But I am also a remote worker, and I love working remote, and I don't see myself going back in the office at the same time, which is why this is a nuanced take, which is code for I'm completely torn on it, and I go back and forth all the time. If you ask me next week, maybe I'll think remote work is, in general, better than in-person work. So yeah, this presentation is my take, my personal perspective on remote versus in-person work. If you want a more thorough and researched list of benefits from each side, Google's a great place to find all that. I'm mostly trying to fill in the gaps in the discourse that I've seen in the past couple of years. which actually is partially captured by these Google results. You can see that the remote work, benefits of remote work, it has a nice header, there's thumbnails, it looks really nice, whereas the benefits of in-person work look boring, there's no header, no thumbnails, it's not as much fun to talk about. Benefits of remote work, we love remote work, a lot of people, it's the newer thing, and in-person kind of feels like people are forcing it on you, so yeah, that's the kind of captures my perspective there. I was going to go into definitions of remote work and in-person work, but when I was timing this, that I was going over, so I'm going to skip a lot of these slides. The main point is that the team structure matters a lot more than the whole company structure. So your team matters more than the whole company. If your team is remote, you might work for a mostly in-person company, but if you're remote, that's what matters more. In terms of like if you're the people you work with every day, that's what matters more than the whole company structure. And I wanted to capture the fact that most companies these days are distributed, which means you're not all working in the same location. You might have several locations, which is kind of what I was saying at the beginning, is there's some aspects of best practices of remote work that can be applied universally. So yeah, that's what I was trying to get through all these slides, which had some nice diagrams I spent way too much time on, but yeah, I have to skip them, so too bad. They weren't actually that great. Okay, that's why I cut it. But they're fun to make. Okay, remote and in-person benefits. This is my non-exhaustive and heavily biased list. I'm not going to spend too much time on each one of these, but I'm also not going to assume that you have been inundated with the articles and posts like I have, and I love reading this stuff. So I'll go over them quickly, but I won't spend too much time on them. So sorry if I gloss over some of the details or leave out your favorite benefits. I probably left them out because they didn't fit in my personal narrative. And speaking of my narrative, the real reason I'm going through each of these benefits is to kind of show counterpoint. And this is what I was saying at the beginning. The best world that we can live in is if we're taking the best of both worlds. So if you're working mostly in person, if you recognize the drawbacks and say, how can we mitigate for those drawbacks? If you're working remote and and you can recognize like these are why in-person work is generally better. How can we mitigate this to kind of close the gap between the two ways of working? What can we learn from the other modes of working? So each of the benefits I'll see like, can you or can you not learn from this or apply this to your mode? Okay. I also have more emojis on this. This isn't too important, but it was helpful to me. That some of them are like have their little silhouette. That means it's more of like a personal individual benefit, and the globe is for like a whole company benefit. And it's not a super important distinction because they're mutually beneficial. If you have a bunch of individual perks for your employees, that helps retention, helps attract talent, and happy workers or productive workers. And for the benefits as a whole, if your company is doing well, it also benefits you as an individual because people generally prefer to work for well-functioning companies. Okay, remote benefits. This is probably in my opinion, the biggest perk of being a remote team is that you can hire from anywhere. You're not limited within a commuting distance of your physical office. This unlocks droves of candidates, including a lot of the referrals that your team might have, which is a great way of recruiting. And it's something that you can't really do if your team is in person. Now, you can make exceptions, but and hire someone remote to work remotely on your in-person team. But this can be harmful to your whole team's productivity, and I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so for this case, let's say, for the sake of argument, that working in person is objectively better than being remote. So everyone who works in person gets this bonus impact for working in person. Now, even if that's the case, you might have this top performer that is still outperforming your average employee who's working in person, even if they have to work remote because that's what they prefer or they don't live near your office. So in this case, what can you do? You could, in this heavily contrived example, go fully remote. No one's going to do this because you would have to like shift everything and you're going to lose all that bonus impact. So what's more likely is that maybe you hire them as a remote worker on your in-person team. So everyone who is already on the team can still get this benefit of working in person, and you add this remote worker to your team and get the benefit of them too. And this definitely can work. You can make these exceptions. But let me tell you, as a remote worker on a mostly in-person team, it is hard. It's hard being the only person who's remote and everyone else is in person. I really like my coworkers. They are very mindful of me. My boss is very supportive of me. But at the same time, I do feel left out a lot. It's hard, like from a social aspect, they all know each other better than I know them. And I try to, there's ways to mitigate this, and I'll go into that later. But it is really hard. And the reality, and video calls, they've gotten a lot better, but there is nothing like meeting in person. And hybrid calls are still really bad. It's better to either have a fully remote call where everyone's calling in from their own computer, or fully in person. So the hybrid calls are pretty tough. And I don't want to ask everyone to sit at their desk when we have these great conferences rooms. So it is hard being like a remote employee at an in-person team. And also, if you make too many of these exceptions, then overall productivity goes down. The remote workers aren't as effective since everyone else is in person, and the in-person workers aren't as effective because they can't optimize for purely in-person work. This is one thing I think that it is better to kind of go all in on one or the other. Like, don't mix your team too much to have a lot of remote people, a lot of in-person people. Decide, like, pick one and stick with it so you can optimize for that way of work. So all that to say, this perk of being remote is hard to do in person. A personal benefit for remote work, if you are doing remote work, is kind of the flip side, is that you can get a job outside of your commute range. This was my experience a couple years ago when I was looking for a job. I looked for in-person jobs, and I ended up being most excited about a remote opportunity. There's a lot more remote opportunities out there. And this also can't really happen if you want to work in person unless you're in a position to move anywhere in the country or outside the country, really. Or if you maybe live in a really major tech hub and there's plenty of opportunities around you, so you don't really need to look outside of that anyway. Another huge benefit of working remote is you can work from anywhere, which is distinctly different from working from home. Working from anywhere includes working from home, but it also means you can work from a coffee shop, co-working space. You can travel without having to take time off. Like I've gone and visited in-laws or other family and been able to work from there without taking time off. People don't really need to know where I'm calling from because I'm still doing the same kind of work. I'm used to working remote. I can go work from anywhere. And not in like a toxic, you always have to work, don't take time off way. It's like a lot of times when I'm traveling, other people are working anyway. I don't have anything to do during the day. And so I can just work and then see them at night and in the morning. So I've been able to benefit from this a lot. But someone who's benefited even more is my cousin Ben, who is a digital nomad. He's been a digital nomad for the past 2.5 years, and he has really enjoyed it. He lives out of his Subaru and drives around the country. He set it up so he can sleep in it. He stays on friends' couches, people's houses, and he has had an incredible experience just working all over the U.S. And his company has been really supportive. From what I've been able to tell, he's still killing it at his company, and he's had this great life experience over the past 2.5 years. And his customers love it too. They always ask him like where he's calling in from, and it's a great talking point for him. So remote work has allowed him to have this incredible benefit. And this also, I promise there's going to be ways, there's going to be check marks and X's on all of these, but this is not one that you can really do if you're working in person. You can still travel, but it's never going to be as easy as remote. You're losing the benefits of working in person when you're traveling, and your day-to-day is going to look very different from, you're not as used to working remotely as if you're working in person. One of the main things that people mention about remote work as being better than in-person work is that there are less distractions. You can do deep work. It's easier to do certain kinds of work, like things that you have to have this flow, this intense focus on. There's less people coming by asking you questions or pulling you into something irrelevant or just chatting or something like that. And you have more control over your particular working environment. You can optimize it for your own personal, what works for you the best. On the flip side, you can also have more distractions at home. There definitely are a lot of people who thrive in person and can't really work remotely. So if you're one of those people, you might have more distractions at home. Or like I slip into bad habits a lot. Sometimes I do have a lot of distractions at home, and and there are ways and methods that you can do to help fix these habits, but you can have, it's not just a given that remote work has less distractions, but in general, I do believe it does. This is something that you can leverage as an in-person worker. You can, if you or as an in-person team as well. If you cultivate a culture of not interrupting, of setting boundaries and keeping those boundaries, if you set up a well-designed physical space for focus, allowing people to focus just like you can at home, this is something that you can do in person to mitigate the drawbacks of in-person work. Another huge benefit of remote work, flexibility in the workday. I'm a young parent. This is huge for me. I'm able to go pick up my daughter from daycare, or go quickly do the dishes during the day and jump back online. It's a great benefit of just having the flexibility in the workday. This also can be a drawback of I guess like also you can start early or work late. You can work, strike while the iron's hot. Work the schedule that works best for you, not necessarily the 9-ish to 5-ish that most people work in the office. With that, it can also be a drawback. I have coworkers, friends who are more on the workaholic side, and this has been hard for them. They have a hard time unplugging. They have a hard time transitioning out of their out of work mode. And also, if you work in a toxic work culture, this can also be a drawback. Where you can be pressured to jump on at any time because it's available. This is something where both the benefits and the drawbacks can happen with in-person work. Obviously, we're not all tied to desktops anymore. Like, you can always work remote for the most part. And if you cultivate a good culture of flexibility and trust, and you focus on output rather than valuing people's presence in their seat and inflating that with their productivity, you can allow people to leave during the day, go do what they need to do, and have that flexibility. But it's never going to be as easy as remote work. This one's pretty obvious. No commute. Not really something that you can do in the office unless you live really close to the office. You're always going to have a commute. Okay, those are my favorite remote benefits and how you could recognize and leverage them as an in-person worker or team. These are the in-person benefits. One of the biggest ones is this cohesion and alignment. It's much easier to feel like a unit when you're all together most of the days, most of the week, as a company, as a team. It's much easier to stay in sync when you're seeing each other every day. Less things fall through the cracks. Cohesion is huge for a team, because even if you have really productive people doing great things, if you have bad cohesion, then you can be working against each other. You can have all these miscommunications and efficiencies, or duplicating efforts. Whereas if you have good cohesion on a team, you can have this exponential multiplying impact as a team. And it can definitely happen remote. I just think that this is something that is a lot easier to do in person. It's a lot easier to stay in sync when you're seeing each other every day, and you can catch those little things. When you're remote, it can be really easy to get out of sync. And I believe that this is how a lot of remote teams fall into the trap of trying to emulate in-person work but digitally, is that you feel out of sync, and then you just don't really know how to intentionally work remote. So you just try to get back in sync by just doing what you know, falling to the trap of doing work as if you were in person. So you need process junkies. You need people who overthink how work is done in order to do this remote, but you can do it. If you have clear goals and missions, meeting up regularly in person is a great way to help cultivate this cohesion as a team, as a remote team. And then having that intense focus that the process junkies that overthink how you're going to do work and communicate as a team. Similar but a little different, collaboration, just working on a task all together at the same time. I do think collaboration in general is better done in person, and a lot of it comes down to communication. There's just always going to be little things that aren't going to come through in digital communication. I've just found this to be the case, that when I get together with my team in person, we're able to do tasks a lot faster, a lot more effectively. Yeah, and there are studies out there that show that that certain kinds of tasks are better in person, especially creative tasks, starting something from scratch. Maybe if you're working like in a bigger group, it's harder to have that effective communication remote and much better in person. At the same time, you can always find articles that fit your narrative. Here's an article that's the exact opposite of what that last article was saying. And reading both articles, the reality is that the first one is kind of throwing people in a room and saying, brainstorm, think of ideas. And the second one involves a lot more training, a lot more intentionality. So it definitely can be done. And just like a lot of the other slides I've been saying, is that this is easier easier in person. So collaboration is easier in person and typically more effective, but it can be just as or even more effective if you put the intense focus on how work is being done and have that intentionality when you're remote. Yeah, and leveraging the advantages of being remote, because there are certain tasks that are better remote than in person. So recognizing that and leaning into that. Yeah, and I do want to also mention that a lot of this can be mitigated with intentionality, but just the reality of the day-to-day is that you can't overthink every single task, every single thing that you do. So maybe you can, in remote work, have as good a collaboration in person, but oftentimes it's easier just to default to the easy things. So recognizing that you're not always going to be able to put the thought process and expect everyone to put that thought process into everything they do. And recognizing that if it is easier to do this kind of stuff in person, that it probably is better in general to do this in person. Yeah. Okay, yeah, another benefit of being in person, belonging and social. It's much easier to feel like you're a unit, like you're a full team company if you're seeing each other most days of the week. It's easier to have the little side conversations, interactions that build those bonds on your team that help foster a sense of belonging and helps with retention and happiness and support with each other. It's easier to isolate yourself when you're remote, to kind of become disconnected from your team, and isolating yourself is distinct from setting boundaries. There's also good, healthy boundaries you can set. But isolation is bad, boundaries are good. So if it's easier, it can be easier to isolate yourself or to have people on your team that isolate themselves when you're remote. So I'm a pretty social person, and I can often find it a little hard or awkward socially to get it started, to get good social interaction started with my coworkers because I'm remote. I found that to be a lot harder. But you can do it well. Meetups is a great way to do that. Like meeting regularly throughout the year is a great way to foster this sense of belonging, the social aspects of work. Having effective virtual socials, so not having the Zoom happy hour where everyone gets on and just talks at each other, putting a little bit more intentionality into how you're interacting, having good activities. There's a ton of online tools and games now that you can do to kind of do this team building, socializing. There are tools like Donut. I've never used it, but I really want. I keep meaning to look into it. I've heard great things about it. Where they kind of match you up with people to have these like little chats with them and create these little social connections. And also in remote work, I've found it's the temptation to kind of just like only focus on work is a lot stronger than in person. In person, you kind of have these chats and conversations. You see each other and say, hey, kind of catch up. So one thing I try to do as remote is like have a little bit of a chit chat before we jump right into the work, or like have social conversations in Slack or your chat app, because those are the kind of things that are a lot easier to have in person, and virtually it's a lot of times easier to just focus on the work and being productive. Huge benefit of being in person is a clear separation of work and the rest of your life. When you leave work, you can just leave it there. You don't have as much of, you still have you just have a clear boundary of work and life, which you definitely can have if you're working remote as well. Big tip that I've heard and I've benefited from is having a separate space in your house for work. You don't really do anything else there, and you mostly use that for work. It's good, clear mental boundary. Something I've benefited from too is having artificial commutes, where you kind of have maybe go for a walk or do a meditation at the beginning and the end of the day to like turn your brain on. I'm going to work, and now I'm going to stop working. That's a great way to have the separation as a remote worker. But it's never going to be, again, as easy as it is in person. When you leave the office, you're done with work for the day. A huge kind of group benefit, whole company benefit of in-person work is this cross-pollination. So this is the teams. So within your team, you're working. This is more like the between teams. So the teams you don't usually work with every single day. So like if I'm on the software team and we're having interactions with like the legal team or the sales team, like these are very important relationships because you get to learn what they value, what they're working on, how you can work together better or work towards a common goal. And this is something that doesn't really happen much in remote work unless you're really intentional about it, and it can happen a lot more naturally in person. And something important to note too is that this does not always happen in distributed companies. Most companies now are distributed, and if you have, and this is how my company is too, we're distributed. All of our most of our software engineers are in Boston, so we don't have this cross-pollination between our software engineers and a lot of the other parts of the company, at least naturally from being in person together. So this isn't an automatic benefit of being in person. This is also something that you need to be intentional about making sure you're doing in order to kind of be a whole cohesive unit as a full company. Definitely can still happen if you're remote, if you're intentional about it. Again, in-person meetups regularly throughout the year, effective virtual socials, all hands, or other good cross-org presentations, learning what other people are working on without, you don't have to do this all the time, but having it every once in a while will be very helpful for, staying in sync as a company. And just there's the fact that some jobs have to be in person. I work for a robotics company. We have mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, and they can't really do most of their job remote. So it kind of, if you want to keep your teams or your broader orgs all in person or all remote, this kind of makes the decision for you that if some people have to be in person, then maybe it's better if most people are in person. So you can optimize for that specific way of work. And just by definition, this can't happen remotely. You might be able to do parts of your job remote, but not the whole thing. So now I've kind of been avoiding this for a little bit, but what about hybrid? Can't that be like this solution where you can get benefits from both being remote and in person if you work in a hybrid way? I think that this is kind of a false definition as it is right now. I think because it's not really a mix of remote and in person. It's really a mix of working from home, not working from anywhere, and in person. Because if you're working a couple of days in the office a week, you still need to be within that commute distance. So you can't hire anywhere. And this diagram is not perfect because remote can imply work from home, but I tried to make a diagram and that one was a lot worse. So, but the idea is that like the main point is that hybrid is not a mix of remote and in person. I really think that hybrid is just kind of a form of in-person work because my definitions that I skipped earlier was that the majority of your work is done co-located with the people that you're working with. Like I was saying earlier, hybrid doesn't automatically give you the benefits of both. You kind of miss especially some of the remote benefits, and you can get all the in-person benefits if you do it right. And that's the key word here because it can be really hard to get it right. You can get it wrong really easily if it's not clear when or why to go into the office. It can feel kind of arbitrary. You can end up going in the office and spending all day on Zoom calls or working with people who aren't there, and it kind of feeling like a waste. Like why did I come into the office? You're also mixing communication styles and ways of doing work so that you can't fully optimize for in-person or fully optimize for remote work. So it can be really good, but it can also go really wrong. And one of the main points from that last slide is like, why are we going into the office? Like what, being intentional about when and why. And I've seen a lot of people talk about return to office mandates and how they're not working well, or like people complaining about them, because it feels like a lot of times they do stem from fear or mistrust. And the key here is making clear why we're going into the office, making sure it's worth people's time, like making sure the office is optimized in a lot of ways to mitigate the drawbacks of working in the office, so learning from the remote work and having very clear, transparent communications about why you're doing that. Let's get that one. All right, a few closing thoughts. There are other remote drawbacks, there are numbers that show that remote workers are more prone to being laid off. They're less likely to be promoted. And I don't think this is evidence of being less effective. And I think bias is a strong word too. I think it's mostly, we're still learning how to value remote work, how to really measure people based off of their impact, their output, rather than it's easier to overvalue people if you're seeing them every day and you can see the work that they're doing. And this all comes down to communication, intentionality, like I've been saying. I think that if you have a bad communication, your company will degenerate into a bad place to work. And mixing it too much they each have their own ways of communicating that. So mixing it too much will make it hard to have a good communication structure. So your company might degenerate into a bad place to work. Okay. So other takeaways, I just encourage you to challenge yourself. If I wasn't able to convince you to kind of think, about how I think about this, if you still think that one way is way better than the other, I do challenge you to challenge yourself and think about this. I thought this presentation was actually really hard to create because I feel so torn about the two things. I hate stating an opinion, these opinions out loud, because I just keep going back and forth myself. But it was a really helpful exercise in thinking about how I work and what's most effective for me and my teams. So I'd encourage you to challenge yourself. I'd say pick what works for you, figure out what that is for your team. Main thing, take best practices from each one, and comes down to intentionality and communication. Thank you very much.